Between the Dal Lake and the mountains runs a narrow strip of land. Here are found in close proximity the celebrated Mughal gardens of Chashma Shai, the splendid spring, of Nishay Bagh, the garden of gladness, of Shalimar Bagh, the abode of love, which make this part of the Kashmir Valley renowned for its beauty. Above one of the many villages, hidden here and there amongst the thick foliage, three tiny kutis had been put at our disposal. They were made of wood, but the upper portion of the walls being of glass, the view was extended on all sides simultaneously. The two large windows and two doors, which were stationed on the four sides of the hut, let in plenty of air, so that one had the impression of living practically in the open. In my own kuti, my hut, there was only room for the bed, the mattress of which consisted of a wooden board covered by a felt namda. A primitive clay stove in the adjoining hut served for cooking, and we prepared our own food. Besides the facilities for bathing in the mountain torrents, there was plenty of water at hand. In the garden, a small fountain played day and night, adding its special charm to the quiet seclusion of the place. Time did not lie heavily on our hands, for we had begun to study Sanskrit and received daily lessons. These included the translation of the slokas of Uptaledeva, a Kashmiri mystic of the 8th century, whose writings reminded one of the mystical transports of our Christian saints. It is not surprising that Kashmir should have given birth to so many religious teachers and yogis. The very atmosphere seems to favor all attempts to scale the heights of spirituality and help man to seek within himself union with the divine. To the south of the Kashmir Valley rises the lofty peaks of Mahadev, 13,000 feet. Owing to the difficulty of approach, these are perhaps less known to the European visitor than the famous Armanath Cave, situated on a high snow-capped summit and containing frozen images of Shiva and Parvati in the form of stalagmites, and to which thousands of pilgrims flock each year. In spite of repeated thunderstorms which characterized the season, the prospect of living for a few days in the exhilarating air of the high mountains proved inviting. A rough track wound up the valley along the side of the torrent. My servant walked ahead with my bedding strapped to his shoulders. He was wearing a nail-shod leather sandals appropriate for climbing. These and glass sandals, less resistant than the former, being made with a sort of coarse jute string, are extensively used by the peasants, both in the plain and hilly districts. Our conversation was reduced to its minimum on account of his ignorance of English and my very limited knowledge of Hindi, but signs and gestures were sufficient for practical purposes. We had been climbing steadily with only an hour's rest since starting before daybreak. At first, the moon had appeared over the summits, reflecting itself in the clear mirror of a lake. Then, as the dawn broke, the plain below had stretched like a blue-green sea to the high wall of mountains, whose snowy heights were the first to catch the rays of the rising sun. Gradually, as we had passed upwards, dark fir trees replaced the fresh green vegetation of the lower regions, and craggy peaks of bare stone appeared between the steep slopes. Now the night quickly descended, and we were enveloped by low-hanging clouds. We must somehow have lost our way, and my servant seemed quite perplexed by it. He sent out a long-drawn shout which echoed through the silent heights. Again and again he called, and at last a faint response came down from a region above us. Guided in the right direction, we finally attained a number of huts lying under the shelter of the fir trees. This is Les Divas, where a few Mohammedan families live most of their year round until the snow drives them from their primitive abodes. I was soon sitting in one of these huts and warming myself before a blazing fire, surrounded by all the members of the family. The walls were made of logs, and two rows of wooden buttresses supported the flat roof. There were no windows, but the whole front of the building was practically open, and in the absence of any chimney, the smoke was allowed to find its way out as best it could. The only room was a large one and was divided off at the farther end by a low railing. Two cows with their calves, a bullock, two goats came in presently from the pastures and found shelter here for the night. While our supper was being prepared, I heard them munching their fodder of freshly cut branches. The air was cold, and it was only possible to keep warm by sitting as near as possible to the fire. I watched the women making the thick pancakes known as chapatis, which, together with rice and maize, constituted their main food. To this simple fare must be added milk and the products derived from therefrom. Vegetables were unobtainable, and the people rarely went down to the nearest village some 15 miles away. I noticed near the cooking vessels an immense immense lump of hard salt, in the middle of which was a curiously shaped depression. I learnt with some amusement that it was due to the tongues of the cows and goats. Salt is used by poor people instead of sugar, which they cannot afford. Salty tea with milk is a common beverage very much in favor all over Kashmir. Worn out by the long climb, I was glad to stretch myself out on my bedding in a corner of the hut. The fire was getting low, and the only lantern suspended from the ceiling had been put out. Through my half-closed eyelids, I perceived the men, women, and children wrapping themselves from head to foot in blankets and lying down side by side on the fern-strewn floor. How they could possibly breathe remained a mystery. Rain had fallen all night long, and in the gray, cold dawn, the people were beginning to stir. The cattle had left the sheds and were slowly making their way up to the higher pastures. The ground had become plowed by their feet as they came and went, and the holes were filled with water. It was not easy to wade through the mud to the nearby torrent, whose icy temperature was enough to discourage the most praiseworthy attempts at cleanliness. After a while, the clouds showed signs of lifting, and we started out to climb the last few miles separating us from the top of Mahadev. Brooks babbled through the green meadows, which were dotted with wild flowers very similar to the alpine flora. The fir trees gave way to dwarf rhododendrons and silver birches, under which carpets of wild delphiniums grew over 4 feet high. Presently the trees disappeared, and we found ourselves at the foot of a high summit. A wilderness of great boulders had to be crossed, leading to grassy slopes where tall, prickly Himalayan poppies of a celestial blue opened their delicate flowers. At length we came to a sheer wall of granite, where shoes and sticks were more hindrances than helpful. Having discarded them, we attained the highest peak. A rough stone indicated the place where Hindu pilgrims came to worship Shiva and bring offerings of ghee, flour, and camphor. For a moment the sun appeared, and through the drifting clouds far below stretched the sunny Kashmir Valley, hemmed in on all sides by the mighty Himalayan ranges. A land set apart, as it were, by nature and adorned by her most precious gifts. The ways of Providence are hidden and mysterious, but there can be little doubt that events cast their shadow before actually happening. The circumstances that are about to be related were foreseen and described several weeks in advance by a 6-year-old Brahmin child. The feeling of inevitability here expressed itself not as fatalism in the sense usually given to the term, which is detrimental to individual effort, but more a calm assurance in the divine law of retribution and compensation, bringing to each man the harvest of his own sowing, and neither to be feared nor eluded. Man proposes, but God disposes, may well be applied to the divine justice governing the universe, and which remains unaffected by personal plans, desires, or man-made laws. In a few days, the July moon was to mark the annual pilgrimage to Amarnath, and I was to join the pilgrims on a 5 days' journey on foot and horseback through the Himalayas. For the last time, I prepared to go down to the village for my daily lesson. I lingered before my servant, sad at the thought of the fast approaching date which would bring my stay to Kashmir to an end. Behind a screen of clouds, the sun sank slowly to the horizon. The far-off summits became translucent, while the nearer ranges stood out in varying tone and color, passing from deepest blue to purple. The plain was already in the shade, whereas the bare granite peaks above the lake glowed with a fiery radiance. It was quickly dark, and when a few hours later I returned up the hill, the moon had risen and there was sufficient light whereby to see the path. Having reached the door, which led through a wall into the garden beyond, and just as I stepped across the threshold, I felt a stinging bite above my shoe. A hissing sound warned me of the presence of a snake, later found to be a cobra, concealed in the shadow of the door, and I hurriedly limped around to another entrance and called to my companions. The pain was acute and the leg rapidly swelled. Without a moment's hesitation, one of the Indians present tore off a piece of his dhoti and bound my leg tightly so as to intercept the circulation of blood. While I was made to drink a cup of melted butter, a messenger was sent down to the village for help. When at length the friend whom I had left so short while before arrived with 4 men and a stretcher, his voice rang out, bringing the calm assurance that all would be well. There was no doctor available in the vicinity, and to reach Srinagar in my present condition was out of the question. Some peasants having spoken of a Mohammedan bone setter living some miles away, and who had the reputation of curing cobra bites, it was decided that I should be conveyed to his place. A strange incident here deserves to be mentioned. Only Tongas were available in the village, but a car was ready waiting for me. It appeared that the owners of the car who lived in Srinagar had felt impelled to come here tonight to visit some mutual friends in spite of the late hour. Thanks to this fortunate coincidence, no time was lost. During the many phases of that eventful night, when the ebb of life sank to its lowest point, I knew with absolute certainty that I should ultimately recover. As I came out of the swoon due to pain and the effects of the poison on the heart, for a few seconds I tasted the exhilarating sensation of blissful happiness and perfect health. It is a fact that during the next few days, in spite of acute suffering, neither fear nor doubt ever crossed my mind in this respect.